This is Author to Author, presented by Cornell University Press. Brian Carso is the author of Gideon's Revolution, a thrilling spy novel based on the real plot to capture infamous traitor Benedict Arnold. He's in conversation with Tim Wendel, whose new book, Rebel Falls, explores a forgotten chapter in Civil War history as heroine Rory Chase races against time to foil a Confederate plot. Author to Author, presented by Cornell University Press.
Tim, let me say that I think you and I have gone a long way to satisfying America's desire for historical spy novels. It's wonderful to be here talking with you this afternoon. I just a brief introduction of myself. So I started out as a lawyer, then became a historian, and I've been studying Benedict Arnold for several decades. And long ago, I came across a story about a spy mission to capture Benedict Arnold. And I put it in my mind. I said, well, I'll either do an academic article about this someday, or wouldn't it make a really cool historical novel? And thank goodness I chose the latter. And so I started work on it in 2016, and it took 4 or 5 years to work on. And it came out this September. And when I'm not writing novels, I'm a professor of history and government at Misericordia University in Dallas, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, we share a lot of parallel constructions besides our stories, which I think is pretty cool. I worked for many years as a sports writer, and that was interesting. And then kind of segued over into teaching. Like Brian, I'm a writer in residence at Johns Hopkins University, which is a little bit of a joke considering I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. And went over and did several historical novels, Castro's Curveball, Red Rain. And the way Rebel Falls began is I don't know about you, Brian, but I love looking at endnotes or where things came from. And I was reading, I didn't finish it all, but Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And she mentioned 2 guys, John Yates Bell and Bennett Burleigh. I went, who are these guys? And then the fact we'll get into how close they came to, seizing the remaining Union warship on the Great Lakes, which is all true. And I'm a little bit of a Civil War buff, and I'd never heard of these guys. And so I started doing some more research on them and their exploits, and then how the Union, pushed back with their own spy network. And you're right, suddenly I was in your land with spies, and it was fun. And that was pretty much the beginning of Rebel Falls, and then got some great editing at Cornell Press. In fact, I think I went through 3 different editors just the way it happened, and all of them improved the book quite a bit. So it's great to be with you, Brian. I'm a big fan of Gideon's, and as one who kind of knew a bit about Benedict Arnold. I mean, you told the rest of the story, and it was great. It was a great thing to do. And I'm curious, how close, you're often, I think you would agree, when you're teasing something out, whether it's Benedict Arnold or John Yates Bell or whatever, at one point you're trying to figure out what's the best place for this. And how close did you come to doing like something else, whether it been an academic paper or whatever, and then what pushed you into doing the novel, which is so well done?
Well, thanks, Tim. And I'm a big fan of Rebel Falls too. And I love how you describe in the author's note that the 2 characters are a bit like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. But that introduces an interesting idea. Like, how do we, and to your question, decide on telling this story through historical fiction? And I talked to a lot of authors as I was grappling with this subject. And I said, how much do you rely on fact when you're telling your story? And there was a whole spectrum there. Some said, well, I use historical facts only to the extent that it helps set a mood or give the background context and so forth. And then way over on the other side is myself, frankly, as a historian, as my day job, I tried to use every single fact that was available. But as you and I both know, when you're writing about a spy mission, there's going to be gaps, right? And so to tell the story, I thought, well, if I can apply good historical imagination to weave those things together, I thought that historical fiction would be my best bet, the best way to communicate what happened with this story. And also to just kind of get people engaged with this larger question of who is Benedict Arnold and what does loyalty in a democratic republic mean, and so forth. So fiction seemed to work really well for the goals I'd set.
Yeah, and I think the whole thing of loyalty, which you brought up, was a great theme to tease out, and one that's, I think, somewhat apropos for today too. Yeah, I agree with you. I guess Thomas Mallon's a friend of mine who's done
Is
some
that
great
right?
historical
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah, and
I know him too. Yeah.
and he's very kind of, as you know, maybe more wedded at times to the historical fact, the burden of the facts. And
Mhm.
and in talking with him, I kind of decided, well, if I have something, I'm not going to go totally against the facts. Part of it is to maybe not so much embellish, but fill in the blanks, as you said, historical imagination. And so, if there's a fact, I feel like I've got to work it in, and I can't go totally opposite on it. But one of the problems I had, and one of the things that changed, was I mentioned John Yates Bell and Bennett Burleigh, and how, yeah, I almost wrote more of it or much of it kind of from their point of view. But maybe it's after living in Charlottesville, Virginia for the last 5 or 6 years, I was like going, no, I'm not going necessarily down that road after we don't have a statue left in this town. So, because they were mostly all Confederate statues. So I kind of pivoted at that point. I'm going, I needed another more major character, one who's a little bit more, historically, in a sense, one you would root for than two guys that are trying to, keep Abraham Lincoln from getting reelected. And so I ended up with this character that I grew to love called Rory Chase, who's kind of a composite of some research. She's somewhat a childhood friend, based on a childhood friend of Fanny Seward's, who is like, the Seward's family's huge in Rebel Falls. And then just kind of working that out. And I wanted a much more, so I say, uncertain or even anxious kind of, or novice hero or heroine, somebody who's kind of placed into this spy network and has to, have to really, take it and run, so to speak. And she's pushing back against more experienced ones like John Yates Bell and Bennett Burleigh to a certain extent. And that was a lot of fun to do. I don't know about you, but I end up talking to my characters quite a bit. And it's a great way to be left alone. People just think you've lost your mind. And one of the things I needed to know Rory's motivation. And some of the answers she gave me seemed apropos not only for the time, but also for our times. Because I think a lot of folks are out there, in some ways, are refighting the Civil War, and people aren't sure what to do. And so that Rory isn't certain all the time was pivotal for me. That was a major insight. And at that point I said, yeah, let's go.
I like the way you were able to use kind of two narrative perspectives from Rory Chase sometimes, and then from the two Confederates. And I thought the Rory Chase character was great because it invites somebody who's not a sophisticated Confederate spy, for instance, but it invites the reader to kind of participate in a way, to say, well, that could be me. I would be like that person if I was suddenly found myself in these circumstances. And right, so telling the finding the narrative voice is tricky, right? I had to decide first person or second person and so forth. And as you know, I stuck with a first person narrator. My objective was to tie various pieces of Benedict Arnold's life together because I wanted the reader to get a sense of what was Arnold's childhood like, because I think that goes a long way to understanding his later actions. What was he like as a hero on the battlefield, one of the great, best American generals of the American Revolution? What do you do when he suddenly becomes traitor, and so on? And how, so my narrator, like yours, is kind of a composite of different people I'd read about in journals, contemporary journals, and so forth, is composed of parts of that story. But I kind of had to hook him all together so that he could appear in Arnold's life at various points, and we could see kind of the moral conundrums at various points between abstract ideas like national loyalty and then very sort of concrete personal notions of how do I do something to this person I know. And your character, Rory Chase, finds herself in that same predicament at various times. You
Yeah.
know, I know this individual as a person, but there's also this big idea at work here. How do we reconcile both of those?
Yeah, very much. I mean, they talk about a template sometimes in storytelling, I guess, where, you know, somebody is sent into a difficult situation and then they have to make this momentous choice at some point. In a sense, do you join them? Do you just kind of let it be? Or in a sense, do you try to stop them, blow it up, which is often the most difficult, you know, one, which certainly, you know, you went through with Gideon. And one of the things I loved with your book was, you know, you say Benedict Arnold, and it's so, it almost becomes caricature or stereotype. Yet you made him a bona fide character that maybe I'm not rooting for, but I understood. And I kind of understood, you know, again, his motivation, why he did certain things. How'd you pull that off? Because that was really pretty cool.
You know, part of it is, and I want to ask you about your research, and this might be a good way to get into that, because I know you and I both did tons of research to be able to be authentic in how we tell this story. But I spent a lot of time going to places. Well, I read a lot about Arnold, of course, everything from early 1800s to contemporary pieces. But I went to places as well that were important in Arnold's life. I went up to Montreal and met a military not, I'm sorry, Quebec, and met a military historian up there to show me where did Arnold's failed mission to capture Quebec, where did that take place, and where was he injured? And I went to West Point, met with the historian there, and walked some of the trails around Tarrytown or to see where Andre was hanged and Tappan. And you start to imbibe all this. And the most meaningful was probably Norwich, Connecticut, Arnold's hometown, which I went to several times. And the members of the Historical Society showed me some things about his childhood, like the church records that showed when Arnold's family was well-to-do, they paid a big tithe and they sat in a family box right up by the altar. And then when they suffered a bunch of losses, several children died from disease, Arnold's father becomes an alcoholic. They can no longer afford the good seats in the church. So they go back to where the regular folks, and a couple of years after that, they're standing in the balcony with the poor. And when you start to see those details of someone's life, you know, it becomes, right, a personal thing where you can feel the emotion, right? It's not just reading about battlefields or legislatures or looking at maps, but accessing that thing that, you know, we all experience life. Life is different in its variety, but in its forms, right? We all experience joy, we all experience sadness all throughout the ages. And how do you tap into that? And I'll just end by saying, I started the novel. I was staying in Norwich in a house built in the 1740s. The young Benedict Arnold had lived in when he was an apprentice. And it got to be kind of late in the evening, and I was up in this room that teenage Benedict Arnold had been in. And I opened my laptop after having done all this travel and research, and it just started to come. Like I could imagine him walking the halls and started writing it. So, Tim, I guess there's a little bit of magic there, right? That we try to
Sure.
get our head in the right space where we can imagine these characters.
You know, it's almost like you get out the Ouija board and you're trying to talk with ghosts. And sometimes they answer you, and that's kind of startling in a way.
But tell me about your research, if you would.
Seward House in Auburn was big. You know, I visited there several times. In fact, I'm going to do a thing back at the Seward House, I think, in a couple months, and which will be fun. And you know, what an interesting family that was. You know, on several levels. I mean, you know, William Seward, Secretary of State, arguably the second most powerful guy in the Union, maybe in the country at that point. And you know, after Lincoln. And yet it's an amazing place because it's it looks a little bit like your office at times. It's got all these books and paintings and all this stuff, and you're kind of going, this family, you know, this Secretary of State was at like one of the epicenters of the world at that point. And so you start going, oh, this would be interesting. But I didn't want somebody who was totally maybe comfortable in that world, maybe a little bit of an outsider who's struggling to get into that world, very much wants to have an impact on the war effort, wants to be involved in some way, which kind of led me back to Rory again, Rory Chase. But I'll tell you, one of the funny things we were finishing up the edits. This had to be with Mohander Kinder, the editor now at Cornell. And we were looking, and of course he thought of this, and I didn't think of it, and it was brilliant. He said, we need a map with this book. And I'm going, yeah, and we need a map. And I'm thinking to myself, you're an idiot. You didn't think you needed a map. And so I got a hold of a map through some contacts at Johns Hopkins. Thank God it was in the public domain, etc. But at one point, so we've decided on this map, and it's both sides of Niagara Falls, US, Canada. You've got the suspension bridge, north part of town, which was an architectural wonder. You've got the falls themselves, which are split, there by Goat Island, etc. And both of us were on the phone, similar to this, and we were like looking at this map that we're going to use. We were trying to figure out the right dimensions and, this type of thing. And one of the things that I have in the book is this place I had, researched, it existed, but this set of stairs, I believe it's 290 steps, down in the shadow of the falls on the US side, very close to the Cataract House Hotel, which plays a prominent part in Rebel Falls. And this would be where escaped slaves in the years before the war started, the waitstaff from the Cataract House would take them across. In a sense, that there was literally one more river to cross before you had total freedom. And we were like, that's in the book. And so back in Mohander and I were like looking at the map in different ways. I think I'm much more of a zoom out look at that point. And he was zooming in. And at one point he goes, what's this? We're putting together the legend. He goes, what is this design, or what is this here right near the falls? And I couldn't see it. I was too zoomed out. And I said, hang on. So I'm zooming in, and now we're very close up, and I'm going, hang on. And it was the steps down, to the dock with the boat. They were literally on this map from 1870. And I don't know about you at some points, but sometimes I feel like I'm getting kind of a bit out of bounds. I'm going, all right, well, I know I did the research on this. I think but that's like more than 150 years ago, whatever. And there it was on a map. And I went, oh, I think we've got it. I feel a lot better about my research in this thing.
First, I like the map. And on the cover, too, there is an illustration of that suspension bridge. I was fascinated by the bridge. Anyone who's ever been to Niagara Falls, and I think a lot of people have, we have an image of what it looks like today, but the history of Niagara Falls, you brought that out so well, like the Cataract House and how people travel to the falls as a great natural wonder, and its place in the Underground Railroad. I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
And it's funny because you wrote so well about place and Gideon, which I want to get to in just a sec, but I grew up only about 15, 20 miles from Niagara Falls. And I've written, several other books that had nothing to do with Niagara Falls. And it was very cool for me to go back to the falls. But as you say, right now, if you go to Niagara Falls, the US side is very ticky-tack. The Canadian side almost looks like Disney World in some ways. And you've got still this beautiful free view, right there. That's one of the wonders of the natural world, in my opinion. But to turn back the clock and realize, yeah, the water's still going. It's still enthralling. I mean, Charles Dickens writes about going to Niagara Falls and just being so overwhelmed by it. He literally just sat there for most of the afternoon just looking at it because it was just so overwhelming. You did a great job in yours with, going back in time in terms of place and setting. How did you pull that off? Because I would be reading the book and I'm not like in present day. I'm back with you, and we're trying to track down Benedict Arnold, and these guys are doing all this wild stuff, and everything rang true. What made that work for you?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to read our stories and try to imagine ourselves in those places. I mean, I tell my students, history is so dependent on imagination. We want to, and I remember Hilary Mantel had, who wrote all Wolf Hall and all, I kept a quote from her nearby when she talked about, if you really want to understand the past, not just what it was, but what it felt like, we turn to novels. So yeah, it was a question of going to these places, allowing myself to imagine myself in that spot, um, and trying to communicate it on paper. That's the magic, that, right? You've
Mhm.
been a writer for a long time, right? How do we get this emotional content and this imaginative content, invite the reader to participate in it? Um, and for me, yeah, a lot of it was those visits to the locations, and to try to walk in Arnold's shoes, um, meant a lot to me. I went to just about all those spots, to walk Saratoga Battlefield, or
Mm.
to walk around, Lower Manhattan. Unlike Boston, Boston's got its revolutionary history. It wears it on its sleeve. But New York, you got to look around for it. It's there, but you got to look around for it. But once you start to look around, yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Um, and it's not, none of this is all that long ago, right, Tim? Like the Civil War is like 150, 160 years ago, the American Revolution, which we're going to have our semi-quincentennial in a couple of years, the awkwardly named 250th anniversary. But that's not that far back in our history, right?
No, I just came back from a trip to Paris and Prague literally a couple days ago, and yeah, the time period you're just talking about is like a
Yeah,
snap of
way.
the fingers, over there and such. It's funny, I think you're absolutely right, Brian, that to go to the places, read the works from it. I think it was Joseph Conrad who said, somebody once asked him, what makes up a quality story? And Conrad's reply was, if I can make you see. In a sense, can I make you see what I'm seeing in my head well enough on the page so then now you can see it? You're going, in a sense, back in time or back to that place too. But I think you're absolutely right from a timing standpoint, at least. I don't know, Civil War. I feel like we're fighting the Civil War all over again. And, some of the things, especially with Bell, not so much Burley, but certainly Bell was a very, very Southern sympathizer, loved Stonewall Jackson, Lee, and I think supported it. We don't have those statues anymore in this town. And I think in some ways we're still kind of grappling with it. And that's why I think historical fiction helps, because I think if people understand the past a little bit better, it arguably makes them, I don't know, better in the present. Maybe it helps them as a elector, as a voter or whatever it may be. But I think it doesn't seem like it's all just coming out of the blue. It's like, oh, we did this before. That's what it's led up to. And I think with both of our books, you can make that case. A lot of what's going on in the present has been led up to, things like, loyalty or, statues and things like that in the past.
I agree with you 100%, Tim. And I'm fond of telling the story that, and one of the reasons I decided to write this book, in the late 1850s, just a few years before the outbreak of the Civil War, Washington Irving was toward the end of his career. People will remember Washington Irving as the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle and so forth. And he wrote A Life of George Washington. And there's 60 pages. One of the biggest chapters is a recollection of the Benedict Arnold story. And Irving said that he wrote about Benedict Arnold, and in fact, he wrote the whole work of George Washington as these sectional tensions were breaking out that would lead to the Civil War. He said he wrote it to remind Americans about the promise of a democratic republic and our obligations towards self-government and loyalty, not necessarily to one man or one idea, but to the idea of a democratic republic. And I thought, man, that rings true in 2016 too. And let's do that again, And I think, to your point, we have to share stories as a people, right? Because it becomes part of our identity.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't have shared stories that we can relate to, that we recognize, this is part of who I am, then it becomes easy to become polarized. And we're no longer looking for consensus or compromise with our neighbors and community members. We become much more transactional. That's my hope for historical fiction like Rebel Falls or Gideon's Revolution, is maybe it reminds us of who we are as a people, what we've been through, and prepares us, like you said, a little bit for our contemporary challenges.
One of the things I'm reminded of is you hear all the time, repeating history. I don't think we necessarily repeat history. Sometimes it seems like events that you're involved in present day, they start to rhyme a little bit. In a sense, they get very, the echoes of the past become stronger. And I think we're in one of those time periods right now, whether it's like, Benedict Arnold, loyalty, Revolutionary War, for sure, probably Civil War. But I'm of the mind that if people don't know these stories, it's like they're blind. They can't make good decisions, let alone reach out to their neighbors and feel like they're part of some, kindred group or even a nation. And I think it just becomes too difficult. I mean, I think we're all also siloed now, depending on what, network we're watching news or how we're getting, our current events. And that's why I think historical fiction breaks through that. It allows to go, oh, hang on, this isn't all brand new.
Yes.
We've done this in some way before. We've been down this road before. And where I find history to be great is it's a reminder of how we did the right things. And things may have been lost for a while, but then we made the correct decisions. And I think that's one of the real powers of historical fiction. And I just hope people read more of it, because it is, as you say, it's the stories of us. And the more you can speak to us, the less we're able to divide up things into them. You, me, I hate that, whatever. And I think that's why it's really, really important. That's why the Washington Irving thing I'm going to steal from you and probably use.
Well, Tim, I agree. As somebody who's, I was teaching a history class this morning, one of the first things I try to do is just kind of break down the walls of presentism, right? The idea that, oh, we're all carrying around phones that have more computer power than the lunar module, and we can fly wherever we want, and we can talk on computers to each other. That somehow makes us different. Well, not so much. It gives us new opportunities. But as you're saying, it's all, these ideas have all been thought through before. Moral choices and decisions have been worked out before. And the best way we can figure out how to live our lives today and how to go forward, I think, is to think about the past and what have other people in our shoes done or in similar positions. I mean, there's just endless amount of lessons to be learned and thought about if we can relate to people who have already done and been through the issues that we've been through today.
So what are you working on now? What's keeping you off the streets?
So I've decided I loved writing this novel. And so that's my gig now, is I'm going to write historical novels, and I have a few more in the works. I I've studied one of the things besides Benedict Arnold, I've done some work on the history of photography and photography as a source for telling historical stories. And I curated an exhibit of Robert Capa's photographs. So Capa was a famous war photographer from the Spanish Civil War through World War II. And ultimately he steps on a landmine in French Indochina and dies in his early 40s. But there was a relationship between him and Gerda Taro, who was a colleague of his during the Spanish Civil War. And, Hemingway, Dos Passos, all these other kind of characters are around there. So I'm writing a historical novel that looks at that relationship between Capa and Gerda Taro and some of the big issues of the mid 20th century.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up photography. I had to cut some of it, but again, we think everything's so new, but in the 1850s, 60s, photography was like taking off. Matthew Brady, all those guys. And I use that somewhat in Rebel Falls. I mean, one of the settings there is the likeness or the photography store in Niagara Falls. And I had a lot more stuff than Matthew Brady. I could do him at some point, but I think, I don't know. I think I'm a little bit on thin ice because I've just started this, but I want to stay maybe in Niagara Falls. And I didn't realize there's a guy, Larry Kerwin, who's a great novelist and does a show on Celtic music on Sirius XM, and I've gotten to be pretty good friends with him. And he was telling about the Fenians, and they went and invaded parts of Canada for a while, right after the Civil War, because they were, most of them, part of the Union Army, and then we're going to swap part of Canada for part of Ireland. And I'm just going, this is nuts. And yet, in an odd way, it reminds me, unfortunately, what means going on in Gaza and the Middle East and such. I mean, our boundaries with land just blur and everything. And so actually, I'm going to go with Larry. Larry does a tour of Ireland every fall, and I'm going in October. So
Oh, that'll be a blast. Yeah, I'm a little familiar with Larry too, from his book Rockaway Blue that
oh, it was a great
Cornell
book.
published.
Yeah. Yeah.
That will be a wonderful trip.
And
But
if I don't get
there's
a
so
book out of
much
it, maybe I'll
that,
just join his band or something. Maybe
yeah.
learn how to play bass. I don't know.
But we seem to separate the idea of the image from the text. But there's a lot that can be done with photography and thinking about the evolution from, the equipment you had during the American Civil War and how you could only capture the battlefield after the battle, right?
Right.
And then how that evolves to capturing action shots and telling news stories. And we live in such a visual culture today that I think these kind of reflections on the evolution of photography and what it meant at various points in our history, I think there's a lot to mine there.
Oh, I think there's a ton. And I think you've probably already found, like I came up through newspapers, and some of the best assignments I was ever on that I enjoyed the most was when they would team me up with a really good photographer.
Mm.
And part of it was they would see the world, in a much different way than I would. And so I found I even relied on them to a certain extent. Okay, what are you seeing right now? Even seeing the angle they set up at and such, and it allowed a different way into the story. So I just think they're geniuses, and you can present the same thing to a photographer that you could to me, and I'm going to say, well, I see that, and they're going, no, look at it from this
Yeah.
angle, and there's the light, and look at the way it's shading his or her face, and it's just great. So I think you're on to some photography, and again, visuals are epic.
Well, I hope, readers will read Rebel Falls and they'll read Gideon's Revolution. And in addition to, I think, a couple of fantastic stories. I mean, I read Rebel Falls pretty quickly because I wanted to see what happened next, right? So they're great stories, but they, as we touched on a little bit, they help us think about all the things we're going through as a nation and a people today, too, because they're about important historical events and they're about characters who are trying to work out difficult situations that they've been put in. And that can tell us a lot about, how we make decisions and how we should think about the world we're in today. So I hope
I
people
totally
look
agree.
at these stories and our history through the fictional tellings that we're telling that contain a lot of actual history too.
Right. I think ultimately, hopefully our novels will help them understand themselves a little bit more or where they stand in the world. And I think that's what I think quality historical fiction does. It allows you to understand better what you're about, but also where you fit in the general world.
And Tim, if anyone in Hollywood is listening, both of these novels need to be made into major motion pictures.
I got one of my guys trying to work on it, but oh man, that writer strike killed things. All right.
Author to Author, presented by Cornell University Press.